We live in a world awash with media of all types. If we're honest, it seems like we have not yet mastered the current onslaught of social media in public life. But this week's guest warns that for good or for bad, the future is coming. He's Justin Hendrix this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host, G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. To do that, we sit down every week with the best storytellers around, filmmakers, authors, journalists, and more, to make sense of the big stories that shape public life in the United States today. To help us this week, we're joined by Justin Hendrix, Executive Director of the NYC Media Lab. Justin, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about the work you do. Tell us about the NYC Media Lab.
Sure. So the Media Lab's a consortium of universities in New York and media and communications companies, and we explore emerging media technology. We do a variety of different types of projects, R&D and prototyping projects, looking at technologies ranging from applications of artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing in the media, onto augmented and virtual reality. So really two key themes, applications of data science in the media, how that's changing the way we consume information, produce information, share information, and then future interfaces, really.
So it seems like just a couple of years ago that emerging technology was seen as a boon to democracy. I remember there was an MIT technology review cover with Bono on it a couple of years ago, and the headline that read, "Big Data Will Save Politics." What went wrong?
Well, you know, we've been exploring this project, or this concept really, through a project called Tech Media Democracy, which is a partnership between several schools in New York, Cornell Tech, Pratt, the New School, CUNY, NYU, Columbia, and we've had about 120 graduate students who've been part of this curriculum over the last year, and really looking into a lot of these issues at this intersection between technology, media, and democracy. So this question of kind of what went wrong, you know, I very much still believe that advances in technology are on balance a positive, and the storytelling potential of these new technologies, the means to communicate ideas, all of this is on balance good for humanity. But we're in a moment right now, a kind of possibly transitional moment, where there are clearly some externalities that we have got to contend with. And they're becoming more apparent every day.
For example?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that we have a problem with misinformation on social media. We have a problem with transparency with the platforms. We have a problem with, you know, interference in our democratic processes from actors who would seek to, you know, influence the outcome. And we've got to contend with those things.
So that's a whole list of factors that you just cited there. Let's take Facebook and Google, for example, which are, of course, along with Apple, giants in this world. Do you think regulation is needed here? Do you think self-policing, which is what Facebook and Google and the others are doing, is effective? What is needed here? I mean, there's a European reaction to that, of course, which is very different from the American reaction, which is more laissez-faire at this point, at least.
Well, you know, in Europe, they seem to have come down very much on the side of the end of social media kind of laissez-faire is here. That it's time to regulate, and we may see some overreaction, you know, in the EU or in Britain, and from other parts of the world. But in the U.S., I think that conversation really has just begun. My view is that it's time to have a very robust conversation about what type of regulation would be appropriate. I don't think that conversation has yet got to be vibrant enough in the United States in most halls, and I think we need to see that really happen. We're beginning to see almost a kind of backlash to the idea of regulation at the moment from some corners. You're also seeing some really bad ideas about regulation coming from some corners as well. So a more vibrant conversation, I think, would help us get to the good ideas.
So let me play devil's advocate here. What would the arguments be against any regulation?
Well, that you would constrain innovation. I think that's the key one. That really, the internet has been kind of a unregulated playground for, how many ever years, and certainly that has created these enormous giants, this incredible amount of entrepreneurial success in the United States that we don't want to constrain that. I think you also saw Mark Zuckerberg prepared to make an argument on Capitol Hill, which I don't think he ever got around to, that there's also a national competitiveness issue here, that companies like Facebook and Google, as they advance technology, as they advance artificial intelligence research, that they are creating a kind of competitive asset.
But let's take the argument it will stifle innovation. I want to draw a parallel with another technology which changed American and world society, the automobile. In the early days of the automobile, I'm going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was no regulation of any kind, of manufacture, of components, of pollution, traffic. You didn't even have to register a car, let alone get it insured. And yet all of that happened in reaction to that. And I don't think anyone could really make the argument now that there hasn't been innovation in the automobile industry for the last century and a quarter. I mean, there certainly has. We have electric cars, hybrid cars. We're going to have driverless cars soon.
Almost any industry that gets to scale, we figure out how to put some seatbelts in, put some rules of the road in place,
Okay.
and create some mechanism to protect the public from the externalities that industry produces.
So you think, you're optimistic then that with this new technology, or somewhat new technology, the same will happen?
I think we're going to have to do something along those lines.
Yeah.
It seems to me that in the United States, we're going to have to tread carefully. There's some things that we hold dear here constitutionally that are important, First Amendment certainly, that may not be as much of a challenge in other parts of the world. So I'm very careful or even reticent to discuss any kind of restrictions on speech. But I think some other aspects of the way we treat the platforms we could begin to look at, particularly their liability for certain types of problems that they cause.
So one of the issues that emerged in 2016 from these platforms was the threat of disinformation. Do we have a clear understanding yet of how extensive the targeting of American democracy was in 2016?
I think the reality is we still don't know, which is part of the problem. That information is locked away in servers at places like Facebook and Google. We don't know yet, certainly what those companies have provided to the FBI and to the Mueller investigation with regard to the Russian effort. We may find out in due course. And what we do know, of course, is incredibly unsettling. Certainly, the reach of that effort has continued to become clear, and the details have become clear. It's been extraordinary how that number has grown. From the first inklings of the interference effort on Facebook, certainly, to what we know from some independent researchers like Jonathan Albright at Columbia and others, who've been able to suss out, some of the reach and the volume of that communication. It's extraordinary.
Do you think the American public is more of the American public is understanding that there was disinformation? I mean, initially there were a lot of skeptics, there still are, it's all fake news and whatever. But it seems to me there's been somewhat of a climb in awareness. Would you agree with that more people at least get the basic concept, yes, something happened?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, there's been a lot of news reporting, of course. Facebook itself has taken some steps to try to inform people. You may remember that after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, they took some effort to tell people, were you one of the people whose information was taken from you? There was some effort to inform those who were affected by Russian propaganda from the Internet Research Agency. So we've seen a kind of slow education process And I think that chimes with people's just kind of day-to-day, experience of being on these platforms, that they see things that they know, can't be true.
Or can't be a coincidence. Like,
Right.
I was just talking about a muffler and a muffler ad pops up.
Right.
I'm using an extreme example, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Were the Russians alone in exploiting our social media addiction in 2016?
Well, we're not entirely sure about that question either. There's some evidence that there were other groups in the party. So there's been some reporting on an Israeli group called Psy Group. That
PSY, right?
Yeah. That little is known about what they may or may not have actually done in the context of the election. All we know about are some proposals that were made to the campaign. Not really much about whether they were, ever acted on. And then, of course, it's quite likely that other state actors were, playing around at the fringes. It doesn't seem like there was anything quite to the scale of what Russia was up to, what Vladimir Putin directed from the Kremlin. But it's likely in future we will see more nation states get in on this game. Alex Stamos, who's the chief security officer or former CSO at Facebook, wrote a piece in Lawfare recently where he said, we run the risk of American elections every 4 years being the Olympics of misinformation. And that seems to be the case.
Let me sort of just press on this issue just a little bit for a second.
Sure.
So, we discussed the issue of disinformation in 2016 and beyond on this show with some regularity. I speak on it in public. I write on it. Yeah. And there's a nagging question in the back of my head, and it's whether or not the public discussion of these issues, which has to be a little bit speculative right now because we don't know everything. Are we feeding the beast? Are we contributing to the very lack of confidence in our democratic institutions that the Russians, it would seem, were trying to exploit? Are we doing good by having this conversation, or are we actually, contributing to the insecurity?
Well, that raises an interesting question to me, which is what is the root problem here? And we know that trust in media has been on the decline for some time, well before we ever read about Russian disinformation or became concerned about these things. In fact, it was on the decline really before Facebook and Google came on the scene. So that's a kind of trend that's been ongoing for some time. And that makes me wonder if we should be pointing to some kind of other issue. And so when we look outside of media and we look at trust in other institutions, we know that many of those are on the decline as well. Trust in government, trust in our religious institutions, many other institutions that make up the fabric of America. So I wonder what that root cause is. I think we need more social science research to get at that. I have some theories, but nothing more than that at the moment.
Well, what's one of your theories? Because that was going to be my question. What is your, really, what's the grand theory here that would account for all of these different developments, which you're totally correct in naming?
In terms of a loss in trust in society, I mean, I wonder if it's something to do with a disconnect between the elite narrative about what has made America work and what people's lived experience is. That there's something that's dissonant for people in what they are hearing from the institutions that guide society and what's actually happening. And I don't know exactly what the answer is there. I don't want to kind of go too far outside of my domain of expertise, but it strikes me that there's something about that misalignment of narratives that has created an environment where misinformation can thrive.
Do we know whether or not there's as much disinformation headed into the 2018 midterms as we saw in early 2016?
There are, as Dan Coates noted in the spring, the warning signs are blinking red.
That's the Director of National Intelligence.
That's right. So, if we're to take his word for it, there is some serious signs that we have a lot to worry about in the run-up to 2018 as well. We know that Facebook and Twitter and Microsoft and others have shut down various campaigns that they have uncovered on their platforms. And I think that all of that points to the likelihood that there will be significant effort to game these elections as well. We also don't know what's yet to come. And as we sit here, I think we're 43, 44 days out from the election. Who knows what hacked material might get dropped, or other bad behavior we might discover in the next few weeks.
Aside from what the large companies, Facebook and the others you mentioned, are doing, do you have any sense of what the federal government and state governments as well, because of course they're a big factor in elections, are doing to defend against this, to see what might be coming, and to make sure that November 6th is a sacred, in the sense of voting, a real vote?
Yeah, well, I think we have seen some good effort across many different dimensions of this problem in some states. So some attorneys general who are keen to confront this issue, and keen in some cases to take on the platforms. And so we may see some developments there that are useful. Some states have done some things that are kind of ancillary to this issue around privacy that I think are useful, including California. And I think we'll see some things emerge out of New York once it's installed its new Attorney General later in the year. I think the other thing to say is on the federal level, unfortunately, I'm not sure we have seen a lot of movement. I mean, it's certainly not commensurate with the threat.
You would think there'd be an alarm bell ringing loud.
Yeah, absolutely. But unfortunately, the view from the top is that a lot of this has been a hoax. That it's not something we should be concerned with, and that seems to filter down into other aspects of the conversation. But even in Congress, there are some green shoots. You see people like Senator Mark Warner, who's released recently a white paper that looked at these issues and actually included some very concrete policy proposals and some things that should be done. There's the Honest Ads Act. There are various other measures that have been put in place to try to create more transparency. And I think some of those developments, hopefully, in the next couple of years, we'll see turned into law.
So you mentioned Cambridge Analytica earlier, and the theft of that data from Facebook. When I think of companies like that, the question that leaps to my mind is, how do we reconcile psychographic analytics, micro-targeting of consumer behavior in an election context, in a democratic republic which is supposed to make its decisions based on reason and rational argument? Is that technological innovation a threat to the social contract, to the way the republic is supposed to work? I realize this is a
big question.
Big question.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that it's doing something to change the public sphere when we're talking about micro-targeting based on massive amounts of information about an individual. That's very different from running an ad on a billboard or placing an ad in the newspaper. And when we look at some of these new technologies for what might be called synthetic media, deepfakes, or other methods to automatically generate media, when I imagine those technologies combined with the capability to hyper-target, to do real-time modeling, to variously generate content that appeals to a person based on their own characteristics, I think then you start to get into a very worrisome place where it's possible to imagine a highly manipulative set of communications.
So let's take that term deepfakes. I'm not sure every member of our audience will know what that means. I don't know what that means. What is a deepfake?
Well, so these have kind of come into the public consciousness over the last couple of years in particular. But I guess the easy way to explain it is it's a method for creating imposter videos that are hyper-realistic. So I could take a bit of a training set. Probably the two of you have been on camera enough at this point on this show to give me enough of a training set that I could map your image onto a model that would allow me to put words in your mouth, or otherwise, animate your actions. And what that then gives me the capability to do is essentially to create a very high fidelity fake of you saying something you didn't say, or doing something you didn't do. And so what people are worried about is that as these technologies get better, as they get more difficult to detect, certainly with the naked eye, that they'll become more potent.
That's insidious.
Yeah, that's scary stuff.
That is scary stuff.
So, so that we don't make the show entirely about doom and gloom.
Why not?
The
Sorry.
the NYC Media Lab, you just hosted its annual conference. What were your big takeaways?
Well, let me transition on this point because we actually hosted a debate on this issue. We called it the Great Synthetic Media Debate. It was really about whether these types of technologies will do more good than harm in the long run. And I mentioned earlier that I do think we're in a transitional moment where society is kind of coming to terms with some of these things. And the reality is that these technologies that we're concerned about here also create enormous opportunity for storytellers, for people that want to share ideas, for people that want to communicate for good purposes. And I think we have to be very careful about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the proverbial bathwater, in how we think about how to respond to these technologies. I have a colleague at NYU called Ken Perlin, who's a computer graphics expert, and he likes to point out that since the dawn of media, since the written word, we've had these concerns that we were going to manipulate reality, we were going to propagandize one another, and that we were going to create problems for society. And at every juncture in media technology, whether it's the advent of the printing press or radio or television, we've had these moments, and everyone likes to point out the War of the Worlds scenario, where people went fleeing from their homes thinking that the Martians were actually invading. As a society, we learn this new medium, we figure out how to live with it and how to put some structure around it, how to install some seatbelts, as it were. I have a worry right now that we're not moving quickly enough to do that, which is why I think we need that vibrant conversation. But in the long run, I'm still very much an optimist that these technologies are going to aid us in communicating with one another, in exploring ideas, in dealing with the massive problems that we've got.
So you're obviously part of a great consortium. What do you hear from your younger people, students, and the younger, the millennials and younger than millennials, people in their teens and early 20s?
Yeah.
On all this. I mean, I realize, again, that could be a whole conversation, but tell us.
Absolutely. So we just, every year we host a summit, a kind of gathering. We have about 1,000 people who come. And one of the big pieces of it is we show off about 100 demos from across New York's universities, whether they're research projects from labs or, creative technology pieces from arts programs in the city. And you just really get a sense of what people are working on, broad range of stuff. And I'd say that the young people I work with every year, that just fills me with optimism and hope, the types of things they're doing with these technologies. A couple of key themes this year for me. One was definitely the mobile augmented reality applications really taking off. Some of the new functionality that Apple and Google and the phone manufacturers have created a new ecosystem really where people are doing some really interesting things. And then the other one was really a suite of technologies that I'm going to, just for the sake of it, going to simplify and say brain-computer interfaces or neural interfaces. A lot of people doing work with how to use signals from the muscle or signals from the mind to augment applications, and for a lot of good reasons. Our winning project this year was a project that created a kind of new hearing aid that uses signals from the mind in order to determine where the wearer is focusing their attention. So if they're in a crowded or confusing environment, the device can automatically signal in on the audio signal that the person is putting their attention toward in order to give them a clearer understanding of the world around them. That type of technology, I think, is immensely powerful, and you're going to see it very soon in the public.
So we got about a minute left. I want to ask you about one other thing. You took issue recently with your former employer, The Economist.
I did.
For inviting Steve Bannon to speak at its Open Future event. What was your concern?
So my concern is that I don't know. I don't want to limit anyone's speech or anyone's ability to say whatever they like. And I believe The Economist, where I was not a journalist, I was an executive there. But I believe that they made a mistake in hosting him. The New Yorker similarly pulled him, from their program, because I think they saw the difference between contending with someone's ideas in print, in a journalistic context, and doing that on stage, under lights, selling tickets to an activity of that nature. I think that that's a different sort of thing. I do take issue with Mr. Bannon, and I do think that some of his ideas are very dangerous, and I believe that we should think hard before we give individuals like that a platform.
Justin Hendrix, it's a great point to leave it on. Thank you so much for being with us. He's Justin Hendrix from the NYC Media Lab. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. He's Wayne, I'm Jim. We hope you'll join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.